I want to talk about the fact that change isn't enough. Change is just managing the habits and the way things look on the outside. Transformation is really what we all need. Transformation is that thing that starts on the inside and works its way outside. So I want you to know the God I wish you knew is the kind of God that's into that. I want to thank my good friend Steve Carter because he really inspired another preacher. He inspired me to do this talk today, and so a lot of his fingerprints are on it. But what I want you to know, first thing before anything else, is that this God I wish you knew, the God I wish you knew loves you enough to transform you. You need to know that. The God I wish you knew loves you enough to transform you. God is not waiting for you to get your stuff together. God is actually chasing after us, and he loves us enough to transform us. Now, the Bible uses a lot of good metaphors for God, and God is the shepherd, God is the father, God is living water. I want to deal with one today we don't talk about a lot, which is God as the potter. So I'm going to be talking from the book of Jeremiah. It's in the Old Testament. Jeremiah was a prophet, and God called these prophets to help people stop wrecking their lives. They went with a message that said, listen, God has a better plan in mind. You don't have to do this. You don't have to destroy yourself any longer. There's a new way of living and a new way of being. And Jeremiah was called to talk to the nation of Israel, who had completely blown it and had lost their identity, and they were distant from God and they were separate from him. And so he went to these people with a message. And in the middle of his prophecy, in the middle of his ministry, God speaks to him. And listen to what it says. It says, "This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Go down to the potter's house, and there I will give you my message." Because, every once in a while we need an object lesson. Just show me what you're talking about. Don't just talk about it. Show me what you want me to say. And so God says, I'm going to give you an object lesson, Jeremiah. So Jeremiah says, "So I went down to the potter's house, and I saw him working at the wheel." Now, I felt like the best way that we can understand this is to actually go down to the potter's house. So I've invited a real potter to be here with us today. His name is Paul McDermott. He's from our Lockport campus. Would you guys welcome Paul? Welcome back. Good to see you. Glad you made it. I went to Paul's house actually because when I was planning for this message, I wanted to know what it felt like to actually make something. And we took a video crew just in case it went horribly wrong, but it didn't, so we have no video, so I'm really sorry about that. I will tell you this, nothing like the movie Ghost happened while I was there, which is good. Like, I wasn't expecting that, I suppose. It was good. But one of the things I learned about as we started to work with the pottery and as I started to work with my hands on this stuff is that pottery doesn't start at the wheel. It doesn't start where it gets shaped. It actually starts with this. It starts with the clay. Now, back in biblical times when Jeremiah was talking, there was no such thing as plastic. There was no such thing as Target. There was no such thing as Pottery Barn. And so for people in biblical times, everything they ate and everything they drank came from a piece of pottery. So if you don't have pottery, you don't eat and you don't drink. Which, if you don't know what that means, it means that you don't live. And so clay was of ultimate value. And that also meant that potters were like the Steve Jobs of the biblical world. Like, they made all the money because without them, what you gonna eat? What you gonna drink? You gotta survive, and so I'm the guy that provides you with the utensils for survival. And so a potter would go out and find clay. He didn't go buy it somewhere because they just didn't sell it anywhere. He would go out, he would find the clay, and he would dig it up. And then he would bring it back to his house, to his shed, to his pottery barn, so to speak, and he would clean out all the rocks and twigs and leaves and everything, and then we'd take it and he would let it sit. He would let it sit on the shelf for sometimes a year, sometimes 2 years, until it had finally softened and matured to the point where it can be used. Now listen, in this story, just to give away the end, God is the potter and we are the clay. And one of the problems we have as clay is we want to be transformed and we want it to happen before breakfast tomorrow. We are impatient clay. We do not want to wait. And that's what makes God the great potter, because he knows exactly when the right moment is to actually take it off the shelf and put it into practice. And so the potter would let it sit and would let it wait. And then once the pottery was ready, he would take it and he would begin to knead it. Now, if you know about bread making, you need bread, but this is different. The potter would actually get his elbows right at his sides and really wedge in there and use all of his strength, use it from the hips out, and he would begin to push and press with his palms. He would make something called the ram's head. It's a little ball. He would begin to push it together with his palms, and what he's doing is, while the clay sat there on the shelf, all these little processes were going on, and it created air bubbles. And these bubbles spread throughout the clay. Now, if you don't get rid of those and then you throw it in the oven to make the pot, it'll blow up. And that is no bueno, okay? That's not what you want to see happen. And so he would get in there and he would begin to press some of those things out. He would begin to press those air bubbles out, slowly but surely getting all of the imperfections and impurities out. And so when God begins dealing with us as the clay, he begins pressing on us to push out some of the stuff that doesn't belong. God is saying to Israel, I am going to begin to press out some of that pride, some of that arrogance, some of that stuff that's going to destroy you in the end. Begin to wedge it out. Even back in biblical times, they used to use their feet to knead because kneading is so difficult and it's so firm. Now think about that. You're going to use your feet to knead it and then you're going to eat off of it, just in case that's a good image for you. You begin to press all of that stuff out. And so the clay could not be done anything more with until it finally got all of those bubbles pressed out of it. And this is important for us. Because in the process of transformation, we're not just talking about changing the outside. We're not just tweaking some habits. We're talking about a complete and total overhaul. And that's why the kneading is so necessary and important. So once the clay has been kneaded, once all the air bubbles are out, then the potter will take the clay to the wheel. Now, the wheel in those times were usually two stones, one stacked on top of the other. And the potter would actually kick the bottom one with his feet to cause the top one to spin. And this one we got electricity, so just bear with us. But what the potter would then do is something called throwing the clay, which sounds a lot more fun than it really is. Like you imagine 3-year-olds throwing clay, but the potter would throw the clay, and what he would do is by force center that lump of clay in the dead center of the wheel. And this is so critical because if it's not in the dead center, once it starts to spin, it'll start to wobble. So that's what happened with mine. I got my hands on it and I'm doing like this, And I said, is this going to be good, Paul? And he says, not really, not even a little bit. So you have to then force it back to the center and press down on it so it stays centered in the center of the wheel, because if not, when you start to shape this into a pot, it'll be lopsided. You remember vinyl records? You leave it out in the heat for a while and it gets this number going on and that's exactly what would happen. And so the potter had to force this into the center and hold it there in the middle, because if not, it's going to get lopsided and deformed. So as Jeremiah is watching the potter, something happens. And it says this, but the pot that he was shaping from the clay was marred in his hands. Whatever happened, the potter had picked up the clay or was working with it, and it had gotten lopsided. One side had started to fall over, or there had been a dent made, or something had broken the clay from its shape that he had intended it to be. Now, I don't know, you may have walked in here and you may look back at your life and you may think, my life right now is pretty lopsided. It's wobbly. It's not going to function the way that it's supposed to in this shape. It is not in good shape. My marriage is wobbly and deformed right now. My relationships are wobbly and deformed. My business practices right now. My inner world is completely off kilter and out of shape. And the question we start to ask when we see that is, can anything be done? Like we see we need change, we see we need transformation, and everything's not as it should be, but then it's like, is it too far? Have we gone too far? Is anything really possible here? And this is my favorite part of the story that Jeremiah is telling. Check this out. It says, so the potter formed it into another pot, shaping it as it seemed best to him. So the potter takes this clay and he says, we can do something else with this. He begins to roll it back into a ball and he recenters it on the wheel. And he begins to reshape it into something else. The most encouraging thing you and I can take from this today is that there is no lump of clay that the potter cannot reshape. There is no lopsided piece that is so far gone that it cannot be remade and reshaped. God is capable of reshaping our lives into exactly what he wanted them to be.